Welcome to More Than Golf. This is Jonathan Knowles. It's great to have you with me in Season 1, Episode 3. In this episode, Scott speaks on how to build a golf swing, the framework for a junior golf program, and how players can utilize stats and technology to improve their performance. The 2019 PGA of Canada National Teacher of the Year, I would like you to meet my great friend Scott.
Hi, my name is Scott Cowx. I'm the head teaching professional at the Hamilton Golf and Country Club in beautiful Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I've been fortunate to be there for 10 years, working with a wide variety of students, from tour players all the way to beginning players. I'm a 22-year member of the CPGA, or the PGA of Canada, and I'm really blessed to be here today.
What are the highlights of the Anatomy Toolbox?
So Scott Cowx Certified is sort of an anatomy toolbox of pieces that I use to change golf swings depending on the needs of the player. So some of the building blocks we would talk about, just in very vague form, would be the way that the wrists function in the swing, the way that the elbow can be utilized in the golf swing, the way that the turn and the tilts of my body and my hips and my pelvis and my shoulders can work in the golf swing, either to my advantage or to my disadvantage. From there, we also talk a lot about how to use the ground in an efficient way possible, and if possible, we can actually increase the speeds quite dramatically if we can integrate some biomechanical principles. From there, there's also some building blocks that we use in terms of even what the knees are doing, even what the neck and the eye line is doing a little bit in the swing. And these are all pieces that I can utilize with a player to make those changes, as I said, very quickly, but also fairly not very invasive, okay, ideally. Some players more so than others. If I can get those pieces across to that individual and we can improve sort of the flow and the movement of the swing as well as some of the geometry, then long term, I think that we have a lot of success.
What would a player have to benefit from efficient motion?
So the underlying biomechanics, which really only recently we've been able to establish accurately from great people like Dr. Kwan and Dr. Sasha McKenzie and some others, Dr. Mike Duffy, really helps us understand what's going on underneath. The things that we can't see on camera, the things that we can't really pick out with our eyes, those things are going on. And players who have great biomechanics, especially in terms of power development, have some distinct advantages. In my opinion, I think the biomechanics and the flow of the movements is actually the glue that holds everything together. So call that, in the old days, you'd call that rhythm or sequence or timing or tempo, if you will. These were all sort of synonymous, is that players have to take a bunch of body parts, make them move in a bunch of different directions, but also be able to coordinate those things well. And I think in this day and age, because we've gotten so micro with a lot of our swings, especially on camera, is that we start to lose the fact that really there are no positions. It's all a flow between the positions. So working on the biomechanics and getting players to actually integrate some movement patterns, I think is sort of the next step. Definitely we need good geometry to hit good golf shots, but to make it repeatable time in and time out, we have to have some blend of both the biomechanics and the geometry. And when you look at a Rory McIlroy, you look at an Ernie Els, you look at a lot of these players, especially at the highest levels, some of them don't hit the best geometry, but because their dynamics, their biomechanics are very, very repeatable and solid, they're able to, lack of a better word, recover the same way every time and hit repeatable golf shots. And I think as instructors, we really need to know how that works. And as just looking at it in my experience the last about 4 years working on a lot of the power development things, it's very, if we know what we're doing, we can increase those speeds, 5%, 10%, very, very, very quickly for a lot of players. Most players are very inefficient with their biomechanics, in particular lower body mechanics. And as a result, they're leaving speed and in some cases consistency on the table.
What types of changes have you seen in terms of power and efficiency production?
So some of the gains that we've seen from improved biomechanics, I've had some players increase their club head speed 8 to 10 miles an hour in about 1 hour's time, which is sometimes hard to believe. But depending on how inefficient the player's lower body mechanics and the way they're utilizing the ground are to begin with, often there are potential gains there. So there's a lot of very able-bodied players that I work with have gone to the gym, tried to find lots of distance, but they just don't know really how to use the ground properly and how to generate the speeds. So they need to be taught how to do that. And that's some of the success that I've had with those players. I've got, so the one junior in particular we were talking about before, in basically 3 weeks' time, took his 6-iron speed from about 97 miles an hour to 111 miles an hour. Just fantastic things. Even myself, when I do the things right, I'm about 8 or 9 miles an hour faster, not playing or practicing a whole lot. So it's just understanding what I need to do, and then certainly the time to work it out and do it. But I find that for most players, they can get a lot of substantial gain out of understanding those principles.
For the junior golfer that wants to play competitive golf, where should they put their focus, and what is your framework for developing a junior golfer?
At my program, we start them as young as 3 years old. So we have a special category from 3 to 5 that they come out very short period of time. The time frame is only basically half hour to 45 minutes. Very small groups, about 3 kids and 1 instructor. A lot of times they're not even touching the golf club yet. They're rolling balls on the green. They're lobbing balls onto the green, understanding what trajectory and chipping and things like that. So it's more of a development to try and basically set the hook, if you will. Try and get them to come to the golf course, want to come and play, and make sure that it's a fun, enjoyable place. After about 6 years old, they start to learn, more involved skills. So we'll teach grip and stance and things like that. Because their development is very staggered, it's very difficult to make any real swing changes or really swing developments probably until they're about 10 to 12 years old. Up until that 10-year-old point, sure, we want them to hit the ball, learn how to get it airborne, learn how to create a good low point and sort of hit repeatable shots that are up in the air. But we're not too worried yet about score. We're not really too worried yet about even the direction all that much. We just want them to hit it and get it up in the air. Once they've hit that 10 to 12-year-old range, unless they're really, really shooting up with puberty, we try and at that point work on more formal skill development, good grip, good posture, some sort of a swing plane swing direction that's going to be reasonable. As they become more competitive, then we start to introduce on-course situations. We start to train them a little bit more in terms of handling pressure and stress through a multitude of different avenues. And when they start to play a lot of tournaments, now we're really refining that. So we go from groups that were maybe 10 to 12 kids in size, and now we actually start to shrink it back down. So a lot of times with our competitive kids that are usually, let's say, 14 to 18 years old, we end up doing a lot of individual attention with them, but then we also play and practice in groups. That's sort of a nice balance between creating a competitive environment for them, but also they get the one-on-one instruction. And certainly as they approach college and maybe even try and turn pro, now it becomes all one-on-one, right, at that point. They have specific problems, they have specific needs. We need to look at that more in depth. So there's definitely a staggered progression of what we do. Just like in the golf swing in terms of power development, there's also windows of opportunity with juniors with power development. So I like the kids between, let's say, 6 years old and, let's say, 12 years old to just basically get the ball airborne and hit as hard as they can, really. Once they've hit their growth spurt, then we can maybe be a little bit more formal with things. But because their bodies change, basically their whole swing changes. So the timing, I find, of their growth spurt really affects their abilities to play as a player. The studies have shown that basically as an adolescent going through a growth spurt, you have no idea where your arms and your hands and your feet are. You basically become clumsy for a period of time because you're growing. So to play tournament golf under those conditions, often some of these juniors will actually fail and get worse a little bit because they're actually going through that growth spurt. It's not until they sort of flatline and get a little bit more stable with their bodies that now those skill sets, the balance, all those things that were sort of tossed on its head during that growth spurt get lost. So hopefully, if we're lucky, a lot of those players hit that growth spurt early. It's difficult for players that are very, very good up until 14, 15 years old, then go through the growth spurt. Because usually when they're looking at highly competitive environments or scholarships or anything like that, you know, that important year is usually that 16th year, right? And so if they are going through puberty at that point, a lot of times they're not playing very well. And unfortunately, there's nothing you can do. Now, by the time they're 17 or 18 again, they might have flatlined and they're quite good again. But usually there's a little bit of dip in performance while they're going through that growth spurt. So we have to be cognizant of that. Every kid's obviously different, but in general, that's sort of how we layer the cake, if you will.
What are the best practices of your top junior player, your top professional player, and what can the average golfer take away from these habits?
I think for my top junior, one of the things that we do a lot of is try and get him away from the driving range, to be honest with you. A lot of the kids, especially in this day and age, they all have phones, they're all taking video of their swing constantly, they're all comparing swings, and sometimes we lose sight to the fact that we need to get the ball in the hole. So one of the things that I do with them when they start to get a little bit, or when he in particular gets a little bit too video conscious, is we will then send him out to the golf course and I get him to play worst ball. So he'll go out and play 9 holes, hit 2 shots off every tee, play the worst ball from that position twice, play the worst ball from the second position twice, etc. It's a very easy game to really show where the weaknesses are in your game. So now you've got to hit 2 drives in the fairway. Now you've got to hit 2 approaches on the green. Now you've got to make 2 birdie putts. And some of these players can actually play, you know, within maybe 2 or 3 over par for 9 holes, playing worst ball. And that's very, very good. The head professional in Hamilton is a former Asian Tour, Canadian Tour guy that actually is from California. And one day he went out and played Hamilton worst ball and shot 67. Worst ball. It was an unbelievable stat. Obviously making birdie putts more than once. So you have to hit it so close to do that. But that's a great game for him and something that I send him out to do a lot. From a professional standpoint, the biggest thing is people don't understand how hard they work and how many hours they spend. You know, typically when Eduardo Molinari is at home, he is Monday to Friday, he will hit balls from 9 o'clock till noon, go home for lunch, okay, come back, hit balls for another hour, and then play 9 or 18 holes. And he'll do that every day for 5 days. He'll take the weekend off to be with his family, and then he'll either be in a tournament the next week or he'll do it again the following week. So the work ethic that most people don't see, they see the pros flying around in private jets and doing selfies and everything else, but in reality, there's a lot of work and a lot of travel that goes along with professional golf. So they already have the work ethic. Sometimes for them, it's about the opposite. It's about making sure that they give themselves enough rest, enough time away from the game. It's very easy for them to get obsessed about the game.
What are the differences between a good amateur golfer and a tour player?
The difference between good amateurs, in my opinion, and a professional is the polish. Okay, professionals are polished in every aspect of what they do. They treat their sport basically as a full-time job to a certain extent. They work very hard, but they also leave no stone unturned. So they're not willing to give up even a half a shot or a quarter of a shot when they can get it. So as a result, their short games tend to be a little bit better, just a little bit tighter. Even though their technique might be exactly the same, the professional is chipping it to 3 feet, the good amateur is chipping it to 4 feet. Okay, and that at the end of the day might make the difference. The other thing between good amateurs and professionals is there's a big step up in the workload to be a professional golfer, and there's a big step up in the commitment, if you will, to your craft. You have to be willing to go out and fail a lot as a professional and understand that it is a process and you've got to chip away at it. And if you let the emotions of a certain situation or a tournament continue to bog you down like a lot of amateur golfers do, you'll have a very short time as a professional. You have to have a long-term approach to it. You have to understand that it is a process. Sometimes you'll have immediate success. Sometimes it's going to take years. And hopefully you've got enough money to last that long for a lot of the professionals. But from a skill set perspective, not all that much different. Just the refinement and the polish is the biggest difference. And then again, sort of the dedication to their craft and the process over a certain length of time.
How would you recommend players use statistics in the game of golf?
Well, I think in golf, everyone's measuring themselves against their friends, against their competitors, simply with their score. But they really don't understand how that score is made up across 18 holes of golf. So traditional stats are maybe somewhat beneficial, but now with some of the stats programs like Golf or Game Golf and Arcos and MyRoundPro.com are very, very good at breaking those numbers down a little bit more effectively. And we can compare those against peer groups that are acceptable. I mean, it's not acceptable for a 15 handicap to compare themselves to a PGA Tour level stat. Okay, but it might be acceptable to compare them to a 7 or an 8 or a 10 handicap stat and say, this is what we're trying to get to. And then that 7 or 8 handicap might be trying to get to a scratch. Okay, so comparing them to a scratch player might be beneficial. So at every level, if they can understand which areas of their game specifically are lacking, we can create better plans as coaches to reach those goals. Okay, and it's almost, as long as that player has enough time to work on things, it's almost, it's very difficult to go wrong with that scenario. You know exactly what we need to do. We can apply that, whether it's a technical change, whether it's me going out on the golf course and doing situational things with that player. But we can improve that very, very quickly. So that's why I love some of the stats programs, because we can identify much more accurately where they're losing those shots.
Could you please give an example on the use of stats and working with tour players?
Sure, absolutely. With some of my better players, I have one player in particular who really didn't believe that he was a bad putter. Okay, was just had it in his head that he thought he was a great putter or even sort of a better than average putter. And statistically, it just wouldn't show up. So when we started to do proximity to the hole, we started to do sort of strokes gained, strokes lost, especially in the putting department. He realized that, he was 3-putting too much. He was losing too many strokes on his approach putts. His lag control was actually very poor. So he would 3-putt because that first putt wasn't getting close enough. And every once in a while, he'd miss that 3-footer or 4-footer because his 40 and 50 footers weren't getting close enough. So we call that 3-putt avoidance. But for him, that was a huge stat. So all of a sudden, when we started to look at it from a strokes gained, strokes lost perspective, he understood which area of the putting. He thought because he made a lot of 3 and 4 footers all the time, that made him a great putter. What he didn't realize was the fact that he couldn't get the first putt inside 3 or 4 feet made him a bad putter.
How can the understanding of frequency impact someone's game?
Well, that's a great thing. Until you break those stats down into that complete detail, you really don't know, right? I can talk to them as a coach, but unless I follow them around and play every round of golf with them, I'm not going to know exactly how many times they hit that 5-iron versus a 9-iron. With programs like MyRoundPro.com, the coaches can see very directly how many times in a certain round of golf are we hitting that. For many of our amateur players, because they don't necessarily hit the ball far enough, they really need help with the fairway woods and the hybrids, right? If they can get more hybrids in their bag and avoid hitting 3-irons, 4-irons, and 5-irons, statistically, usually they're going to improve their chances of hitting that green. Those hybrids are a little bit easier to hit than those longer irons. As you mentioned, most amateurs will go out and hit a 7 or an 8-iron, and they're very comfortable with it. But in reality, because the courses are generally quite long for them, they don't really hit those 7 or 8-irons all that much. They end up hitting hybrids or longer irons, and maybe they're not quite as good with those. So statistically, we can see that. If it comes down to perhaps a technique idea, then obviously we can set up some coaching sessions on how to improve the technique. Sometimes it's a club fit problem, right? There's gaps in it. They've got old equipment that's maybe not going to perform too well. Sometimes they can actually make some improvements in their game literally by buying a better game, okay? But as coaches, if we can identify exactly where those weaknesses are, then we can better assess that. And certainly as players become more competitive, that's something that we're going to look at very, very, very closely to make sure that they're hitting all of their clubs well. And if they're not, we either need to change their club or change their technique with that club.
This podcast was recorded in Billund, Denmark, 2016. Thank you for listening. Please check back soon for the next episode.